All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jason Flame, and welcome to the Master Motivation Show. And today we're joined by Mr. Stephen Oliver. I'm going to read you a portion of his bio today that I posted earlier. Stephen Oliver started martial arts in 1969 with the Jhoon Rhee Institute. He worked his way through Georgetown University, expecting to go on to an NBA, then Wall Street. Hoping at the same time to be the next kickboxing champion, training with Jeff Smith and their stable of fighters. Instead, he moved to Denver in 1983 and opened 5 martial arts schools in 18 months, 6 in 30 months, and growing to 2,500 active and over $1 million in revenue by age 25. He was a founding member of the Educational Funding Company's board of directors and their first high-profile client and national speaker for that organization for close to 20 years. In 1989, he became a NASKA World Tour promoter and ran the Mile High Karate Classic for 10 years on that circuit. To date, he's run over 110 Intramural tournament events and have created well over 1,000 black belts. Mr. Oliver, thank you so much for being on the show today. Welcome.
Hey, good to have you, or good to be here, wherever I am at.
Yeah, well, I'm in California, and you're still in Denver, yes?
I'm in Evergreen, Colorado, at about 8,000 foot elevation, so I'm on the top of the mountain just outside of Denver Metro.
Okay, cool. Well, hey, again, thanks for being on the show. I think a lot of people will get a lot of, good information just hearing your experience and sharing some of your knowledge. So definitely appreciate your time. Can you start out just kind of giving me an idea of how you went from wanting to get an MBA and go on to Wall Street to opening martial arts franchises?
Well, it was kind of a strange transition. I guess the first thing that happened is my first what would it be, from 69 to till I moved to Washington D.C. But we were a branch of the Jhoon Rhee Institute, just like Alan Steen and Pat Burleson and all of the different Taekwondo guys in Texas, Oklahoma were, frankly. But all of our instructors had this view of you can play karate for a while and then get a real job. None of them had any idea that this could become a career, which in retrospect, I find it really strange because we had Jhoon Rhee coming to Tulsa, twice a year, Jeff Smith coming out. The Jhoon Rhee Institute was a multi-million-dollar martial arts school operation in Washington, D.C., but there really wasn't any discussion about, teaching martial arts, anything else as ever being a career. So I was 16 years old and had no vision of that as something that was even possible until I went to Washington the first time when I was 16. And I tell the story. I trained with Joe Lewis, Bill Wallace, and Jeff Smith all in the same month when I was 16. But when I went out to Washington the first time when I was 16, I sat in on a business meeting. I met Nick Kokinas, and this is 1976. Met this stable of professional fighters, but this stable of school owners. And, Jeff picks me up at the airport driving a Mercedes SL. And, I stayed at his house, and he had this beautiful home out in Maryland at the time. And I went, wow, this is great. Jeff, I didn't know Master Smith, Mr. Smith, I didn't know you were making this much money fighting. He goes, no, I'm not from fighting. It's from running martial arts schools. Oh, really? Tell me about that. So that was my eye-opening experience really then. But
that's
still good.
I just had to cut in because you're throwing out these names to most people that are listening that are martial artists. It's like you're naming off the Mount Rushmore of martial artists from back in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. That's just what an amazing experience at 16 years old to be exposed to that. How did that even happen? What was your reason for going out to Washington?
Well, I ended up taking over our school, if you will, and really what it was is it was a little club in a YMCA. But I ended up taking over our club because one of our instructors ended up taking over the family business. Another one became a full-time reeler and didn't have time to teach. So really at 14, 15, I was running the school myself. Not that it really qualifies what I'd call a school anymore, but my only real source was to keep traveling back and forth to Washington to be engaged with the organization we were affiliated with, was Jhoon Rhee. And at the time, I found other people in Oklahoma to train with. I was training with Roger Green and a number of other people, who was Joe Lewis's first black belt. But I was traveling back to Washington. I traveled back when I was 16, traveled back when I was 18, and then ended up moving there when I went from my junior to senior year, or I'm sorry, my sophomore to junior year in college.
Hmm. Yeah, tell us a little bit more about what it was like to be involved with the Jhoon Rhee Institute.
Well, it depends upon at what association you were, right? If you were a little branch in Tulsa, Oklahoma, you know, there was some curriculum, and Jhoon Rhee came out and gave tests every now and then. But once I was actually in Washington, D.C. on staff, it was a completely different world, right? I mean, this was, we had Nick Okinis, who Jhoon Rhee had, and the backstory, by the way, of how the martial arts business developed is really, to me, fascinating, because Pat Burleson had a couple of guys who were with the Fred Astaire Dance Studio Organization.
Hmm.
And they taught Pat Burleson the business operations for these ballroom dance schools, right? And he brought in his instructor, Jhoon Rhee, and he brought in Ed Parker and taught Ed Parker and Jhoon Rhee these business operations methodologies from Fred Astaire Dance Studios, right? Jhoon Rhee then goes back to Washington, D.C. and says, okay, the dance studio guys know what they're doing. So he looked for somebody that he could bring in to help him. And that's how he found Nick Okinis, because Nick Okinis had been the district manager for Arthur Murray Dance Studios in Washington, D.C. And then he had a chain of Art Linkletter Totten Dance Studios. And so Jhoon Rhee finds Nick, hires Nick. And so now he has this in-house consultant who has an extensive dance studio business who helps him develop. And of course, if you look at West Coast, East Coast, you know, pretty much anybody in Taekwondo from Texas, Oklahoma, or then from Washington, D.C. and outward somehow spouted out of Jhoon Rhee. And then anybody in Kempo on the West Coast spouted out of Ed Parker. So those two organizations. And frankly, then you had Pat Burleson move to L.A., and helped Joe Louis sell his share of the martial arts school that was jointly owned with Bob Wall to Chuck Norris. Mm-hmm. And then he taught Chuck Norris and Bob Wall the Fred Astaire systems and helped them develop schools throughout LA. So it's interesting how it kind of evolved. And the root source was Pat Burleson back in the day in the early 60s.
Well, if that hadn't happened, my instructor was a student of Pat Johnson and Chuck Norris and ran a school in Sherman Oaks, California. So without those systems being taught to them, I may not even be having this interview right now or have ever been involved in martial arts. My instructor is Dennis Ichikawa, who is still teaching to this day. And there are several schools that he trained and taught under him that are still operating.
There you go. There you go. It all ties back to that.
It all kind of trickles down. Yeah. Tell me about your martial arts training in the early years, 60s, 70s. Yeah. Very different than what it is now. Obviously, everything evolves over time, but you hear lots of people talk about the blood and guts era of martial arts.
Well, I wrote a chapter in one of my books that was called "The Good Old Days Never Were." And what you have, I tell people all the time, if you started martial arts in the 60s or 70s, you must have had a couple screws loose to have not fled the building within the first lesson or two. But it was a very different era, and I think a lot of older people look back at it. I had Alan Steen crack a joke one time. He says, "The older I get, the better I was." But all you have to do is look at the old films, and the quality of the teaching then was not nearly as good as it is now. The quality of the environment was not nearly as good. And of course, Jhoon Rhee invented the safety equipment because Pat Worley got injured fighting Mike Warren, and he realized how dangerous what we were doing was, bare knuckle. But it wasn't anything to write home about. I tell people it took me 9 years to get my black belt. And in the Jhoon Rhee Institute, we were promoting black belts in 3 years. And the black belts we were promoting in 3 years were every bit as good as I was after 8 or 9 years, right? It's just that the teaching environment was better. The quality of the instruction was better. The consistency was better. Everything was better. And so the evolution over that period of time was pretty rapid. And of course, what most people did is they clung to the traditional stuff. Every time something new was, they thought about their instructor going back, 50 years. But those guys weren't brilliant. They didn't have great teaching methodologies. They were just doing the best they knew how to do at the time. My instructors, were fine for the 60s and the 70s, but they didn't know any better. Their level of knowledge on teaching methodology was like this compared to, where we're at. So, it's interesting. I mean, it was definitely rough and tumble. It was full contact, bare knuckle, and, supporting leg sweeps on concrete and tile floors. Again, I was talking to Alan Steen about a tournament I competed in 1975, I think, or 74. And he said, oh, yeah, we had 45 ambulance runs that day. Well, I promoted over 120 tournaments, 11 of them or 10 of them being big national events. We may have had one ambulance run in 30 years, right? He had 45 in one day. And that gives you the comparison. This was concrete floor, first time anybody had used pads, supporting leg sweeps were legal. So somebody kicks at you, you grab them, you sweep their supporting leg, bounce their head on the concrete, and hit them within 3 seconds, and you win. Well, okay, I mean, I won, but that's not exactly very safe. It makes the early UFC fights look tame in comparison.
Right. Yeah. Hey, real quick, we got a couple people watching right now. If you guys are watching now live and you have any questions, please drop them in the comments. We'll be sure to address that. Would love to hear from anybody watching. Just drop a quick comment. But kind of back to the tournaments. Tell us some of your favorite tournament stories. I mean, you've watched a lot of great competitors in your year. What are some great stories?
Well, I mean, there's the spectrum, right? Because I was. From day one, I was always hanging out with Jeff Smith. I was the long-haired teenager that was showing up at different events with him. But my first big tournament experience was Jack Wong's tournament in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, and I must have been 12 years old. I don't remember, but all I remember is the first thing I did is I walked in. I saw Jim Harrison, and Jim Harrison was fighting. And Jim Harrison had gotten a broken nose, and he was setting his own nose with his whole uniform covered with blood. And, of course, by the time it was all done, if I remember correctly, he won first place in black belt with a broken nose, with, a few places he needed stitching, and going over and setting his own nose in the middle of the fight, right? So that was my first exposure to tournament competition. Then I remember I ended up, and again, I was like 12, weighed, nothing. I end up with it as junior divisions were back then. I'm like a 12-year-old gold belt with a 15-year-old brown belt. And this kid had legs, in my recollection, 6 foot long legs. I'm sure it wasn't really that bad. But I only had one technique, and it was leap and back fist. He only had one technique, and it was side kick. So what happened is every time I moved, I did a back fist, he did a side kick. Each clash, he'd get the point, I'd get the point, he'd get the point, I'd get the point. And I would every clash end up through 3 rows of chairs, right? Sucking wind. So by the time it was done, I won the fight. But of course, I couldn't breathe for 8 hours after that, right? So, that was the good old days, right? Not really.
Well, like you said, to make it through those years, and I didn't start martial arts until the 80s. And we all talk about the old days and how it was tougher or whatever. And, at the end of the day, yeah, there's some really fun things to talk about and some great experiences. But, unfortunately, that type of training and that type of competition is what chased a lot of people away from martial arts. And in the end, the people that we chased away are the ones that needed martial arts the most.
Yeah.
So it just didn't really serve a really good positive effect, in the long term.
Yeah. Well, I can make that statement worse. I have in big audiences, 300 school owners or in regional things with 50 school owners, talked about those traditional guys and said, well, look, everybody you ever touched sucked. And they're like, well, what are you talking about? Our black belts. It's like, yeah, but you had a 20% a month dropout rate. So statistically, everybody you ever touched dropped out by the time they were on their 4th month. And by the 4th month, they weren't any good to begin with, and they only started getting worse, right? So sure, you produced a black belt here and there. And sure, they were rough and tough. And those black belts those guys produced that were rough and tough and one thing or another, they could have watched a video and gotten good. They were just genetic mutants who were willing to train hard and train, 5 hours a day and all that other stuff, but they flushed out everybody else. That's, I was doing regional seminars a few years ago pre-COVID, and I started out, I was using an example of Harvard and their graduation rate, and noticed everybody had glassy eyes and weren't getting it. So I started saying to the martial artists, I say, how many of you think you have a better graduation rate than the worst public school system in the United States? And at the time, it was Detroit Public Schools. To their credit, they've gotten better. But Detroit Public Schools, who in here thinks you have a graduation rate better than Detroit Public Schools? And of course, they'd all raise their hand. Of course, we do. And I'd say, well, Detroit Public Schools graduates 45% of the kids that they touch to high school, or to, from their high school diploma. How many of you graduate 45% of everybody enroll to black belt? Well, nobody, right? And so that's still the problem with the industry. Our guys end up with like 1 or 2% a month dropout rate, but still, they're losing 10 or 12% a year, 24% in 2 years, 36% in 3 years. But most martial artists, as you know, Jason, are losing 7, 8, 10% a month. They don't even know it. They think they're great instructors, but they have 5 great A+ students that are in their face, and everybody else is done by the time they're gold belt or green belt.
Well, and I couldn't help but thinking of the quote. Frank Silverman uses it a lot, and he quotes Yogi Berra: "You don't know what you don't know." And so these people that think my classes are great and my retention is great, but they're not really actually right. Yeah, all my students love me, and they don't know their numbers. And man, that's pretty profound actually when you put it in that perspective of year to year. After 4 years, graduate, what percent are graduating to black belt, and we talk about it all the time. I mean, getting to black belt is great, but that's really not, that's the beginning. That's not the end. That's not the end. And a lot of schools will tout that we are a black belt school, but
they're full of shit.
But they don't teach and train as if that's goal. And really, I'm not a huge fan of that term in general, only because to me, martial arts is a lifestyle. It's not something that I want you to do for 1 year or 3 years or even 5 years. I want it to be something that can last and go through your whole life, because it helps with baseball. It helps with school. It helps at home. It helps you be a better community member. Martial arts is a way of life. It's a little cliche to say, but that puts a different mindset, a different spin in our schools.
Well, I certainly don't want them to be, they went in as kindergartners and they dropped out before they got to first grade. Right. And black belt is like being a third grader. Second degree black belts be like being a sixth grader. Third degree black belts like being a middle schooler. Fourth degree black belts like you're in high school. Fifth, sixth, seventh is like now you're in college. I mean, that in comparable terms is really what it means. And you're right. If somebody trains for 18 months, they're dangerous to themselves. They really haven't accomplished very much. They certainly haven't accomplished life-changing permanent benefit from what we're doing.
Well, I hope that at some point any one of my students will watch just this portion of the conversation, because when you put that into a great context of and depending on where they start, we start at age 3. So if you start at 3 and you're going right until 4th degree black belt, you're at college level. If you start maybe at 5th or 6th grade, you're still relatively, that's a short amount of time in your life when you could literally, as we have done, most of our lives have been committed to martial arts.
Another great reference before we shift topics is, one of my favorite movies is Days of Thunder, with Nicole Kidman and Tom Cruise. And there's this great line in there where I think it was Robert Duvall's character says, race car drivers don't like to go to the hospital. And to me, martial arts instructors don't like to recognize everybody who's dropped out. A friend of mine, Keith Hafner, runs a great school in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I was in his office one time, and he has this board that's kind of like, think of a boardroom in a hotel where it, folds out, and there's a bulletin board on one side and one thing or another. And there's these Polaroid pictures up there. And I said, Keith, what is that? He goes, "Oh, that's everybody who dropped out last month and I'm pissed off about." Okay. I said, "How do you use that?" He goes, "Well, every time we have a staff meeting, I open the board and I rant and rave and complain about the people." I said, "Well, were there some others who dropped out that you aren't pissed off about?" He goes, "Yeah, occasionally we enroll somebody who probably wasn't a good fit." But what he's doing is every time he has a staff meeting, he's reminding everybody of all those people are in your face telling you about how great of an instructor is. That's not the criteria of whether you're a good instructor or not. It's how many people end up on this board over here and, drop out without ever really achieving anything.
Right. Right. Well, let's get into a little bit more of the business side. And, so you mentioned you took over a program that was in a YMCA or a Boys and Girls Club.
Yeah, that's back when I was 14. Yeah.
Right. And then how did you progress from there as an instructor to owning your first school into multiple schools?
Well, I went from Tulsa to Washington, D.C. because I guess for two reasons. Jeff Smith and Jhoon Rhee had offered me a job teaching for the Jhoon Rhee Institute, but I was a National Merit Scholar and an A student, all that kind of stuff. And I had actually applied to Georgetown, to Princeton, to Wharton, and to I don't know, somebody else, Stanford, and ended up getting accepted at Georgetown. And really, I wanted to go to Georgetown because I had a job teaching martial arts in Washington. So I thought, I'm going to go to Georgetown, get a bachelor's in economics, an MBA at Harvard, and end up in Wall Street. And at the same time, I'm going to become the next Jeff Smith because I had this vision of, I'm going to be the world kickboxing champion. And I told Don Wilson. I told Don Wilson, he's the one that convinced me not to be a professional fighter. He said, "How is that?" I said, "Well, I was training every week with Rodney Batiste, who I was teaching with. Rodney was the U.S. champion. He had just knocked out Ray McCallum, and he was fighting Don Wilson. And I said, Don, he hit you with an overhand right. And the first thing I thought, because he was hitting me with that like every day, I was holding medicine balls for him, and I'd be bruised over here. I said, he hit you with an overhand right that I immediately said, oh, my God, I'd be in a coma if I wasn't dead. And you just went like this and smiled and ended up winning the fight. He goes, yeah, he broke my nose. I said, yeah, but you smiled. I would have been in a coma. and so, I concluded, because we had the staple of fighters. We had the U.S. welterweight champion. We had the U.S. middleweight champion. Obviously, we had Jeff Smith. We had Jerry Rome, who ended up being the world heavyweight champion for a while. He was coming up in training. Bill Wallace and Joe Louis and all those guys were coming up in training. We had this huge stable of really the best in the world that was there training. But I figured out pretty quickly that Jeff was a genetic mutant. And, back then, if you took the list of the top 10, I figured I could have been number 4 or 5. And number 4 or 5 was fighting for $100 a round, having somebody who was a trained killer trying to, hit you in the frontal lobes. It didn't seem like a good career choice to me. I had a conversation with them all, and they still laugh about it to this day, because here I am, the college boy with all these professional fighters. I said to Jeff, how exactly is this being a professional fighter? He said, what do you mean? I said, okay, so you train 35 hours a week. You're over on the Nautilus and you're doing, a stationary bike, bicycling, running, rounds, all this stuff. You're training 35 hours a week. Last fight was a big one. You got $5,000. That was 8 weeks of training. And most of these guys, like Rodney, was getting $100 a round. I said, most of the fights are like they're getting $500 or something like that with no medical. So if you divide that out by 40 hours a week for 8 weeks, let's say 6 weeks, it comes out to be about 1/10 of minimum wage. How is this being a professional fighter? And he said, well, I mean, we all just love martial arts. We'd be training anyway. I said, not 35 or 40 hours a week. No, I'd be training 10 hours a week, not 40 hours a week.
Right.
Not with another trained killer trying to put me in a hospital. No, I wouldn't be doing that for fun, And so that was the mindset shift of, I'm not going to be a professional fighter, right?
Right.
And most of the guys, by the way, were breaking their hands all the time. They had stress fractures from doing bag works. Every fight, they'd end up breaking a foot or breaking a hand. I was like, this does not make any sense whatsoever, unless you're Mike Tyson or you're a Jeff Smith or you're a Bill Wallace or you're John Easterio. I mean, those guys were just so much a cut above everybody else that it wasn't even funny.
I love hearing all this stuff. This is just so fun to hear. But I got to share this,
Yeah.
and I want to thank my good friend Jose Escobar, who's saying good day to both of us, and he shared this in his groups, the Entrepreneurs Bookshelf and the Connected Leaders Academy. Very proud to be part of both of those groups, and thank you, Jose, for watching and sharing. Please let me know if you have any questions for Mr. Oliver. Love to get some questions and feedback from you
Sure.
as well. So let's continue from there. So you decided I'm not going to be a pro fighter because maybe it just doesn't make sense,
No,
right? I mean,
no.
it would be a lot of fun, but just didn't make sense in the
Well,
financial realm.
it'd be fun to be an amateur fighter.
Sure,
Being a
right?
pro fighter was a complete different scenario.
So then you went on to, owning your first school and opening
Yeah.
a chain of schools. Talk about that.
Yeah. Well, again, I was working for Jhoon Rhee, and I went and interviewed with the big firms in New York, right? So when I was getting ready to graduate from Georgetown, and everyone I talked to, there was the training program in Manhattan, and they were all paying less than I was making running a martial arts school. I mean, inflation adjusted, I was making like a six-figure income while I was a college student, running a martial arts school. And I said, well, hell, this is, it seems to me after I really look at it, running a martial arts school is a lot more fun. And two is now I have had my eyes opened that this can be a real lucrative career, right? And so my mission really was with Jhoon Rhee's help. Jhoon Rhee, I mean, may rest in peace. He let me go through the file cabinets, and he told me, let me really look at everything that was going on. This was a big multi-million-dollar operation. Any question I ask, everything was on. What's your budget on TV? What's your budget in the Washington Post? How are you coming up with these? All of that was open. And I did figure out, because they trained me on how to do an intro, how to do an enrollment, how to keep track, all of that stuff, but I didn't know anything about marketing. So about a year and a half earlier, I started going to the Library of Congress, and I started peppering Jhoon Rhee with questions, and started peppering Nick Okinis with questions, and started going through the file cabinet. But really what I did is I spent 2 years studying marketing, because I knew how to teach an intro, knew how to do an enrollment, knew how to do a renewal, knew how to teach class. I knew nothing about how they were getting the phone to ring, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I spent 2 years studying marketing. And back then it was studying Ogilvy on advertising, studying old, Caples and those guys on old direct response marketing, one thing or another, but studied all of that. And then again, with Jhoon Rhee's blessing, with Jeff's help, with Nick Okinis' help, and the idea was sort of Nick's of opening as many schools as I did. In retrospect, that may have been a bad idea, but what I did is I was going to go to Denver and replicate the Jhoon Rhee Institute, which at the time had 9 locations. So I put together the business plan. I had a partner with money. I didn't have any money, but I had the knowledge, put together a business plan, moved to Denver, loaded up the U-Haul, and as soon as I got there, the partner backed out. And so basically, I had a pocket full of credit cards, and my father loaned me $10,000. And on that capitalization, as you said, I did 5 schools in 18 months and 6 schools in 30 months. But the formula was pretty straightforward, which I had figured out from Jhoon Rhee Institute. I had to have 100 students in the first month. And on month 3, we did a renewal blitz. And the month 3 renewals paid for opening the next school. And it happened over and over and over again. So I, at first it was all labor. And then it was money and labor for all of the marketing to fill the school. And anytime I was opening a school, if I had $10,000 available, I spent $9,500 on advertising and $500 on, let's make the place look, maybe I could get a desk and some chairs so I have some place to do enrollments, and then just kept spinning it from one to the other to the next.
Mm-hmm. And what was your model? I mean, I'm assuming that it was not, large school, large student base, right? When you're running multiple locations, smaller school, smaller base, one or two instructors. What was your model?
Well, I guess it depends on how you define it. Is the Jhoon Rhee schools were, at that time, probably in the range of 200 to 500 students, and in the range of 3,000 to 5,000 square feet.
Okay.
And my first school was 2,400 square feet. My second school was 2,100 square feet. My third school was 3,600. My fourth school was 3,500. My fifth school was probably about 4,500 feet. And then, and really I was kind of targeting is in that 3,000 square foot range. And ultimately I came to conclude that 2,400 square feet, 300 active students was probably prime. But the first school, when Karate Kid came out, we had that one at 600 active with 2,400 square feet.
Right.
But that was sort of the target. Was 2 full-time people, program director and instructor. So every school had 2 full-timers, and every school, my target was to be between 200 and 300 students within the first 6 months, and preferably within the first 3 months. So most of them were like 100 students in the first month to 6 weeks, 200 students in the first 3 to 4 months, and then 300 students maybe in 6 months. So that was my target with each one of them.
And remind me again, this is in the early 80s.
83.
Okay.
Yeah, 83, 84, 85.
And of course, it's all relative, but back then rent was probably a little bit different. Pay was a little bit different. No?
Adjusted, it was horrible. For people, most people don't have much of a sense of history. I opened in kind of the end of the Reagan boom. That, let's see, I may be screwing up my dates here a little bit, but I ended up in the mid 80s, in the middle of the worst recession since the Great Depression, part 1. And that was the banking crisis that was perpetuated by the S&Ls. Some people forget the other Bush family member, which was Neil Bush. So Neil Bush was the CEO of Silverado Bank, which was a savings and loan. And you had all of these savings and loans who had been deregulated, just like the 2007, 2008 crash. It was just the first version of that. So I opened into boom with real estate at its max. I had when I was 25 years old, $30,000 a month in rent.
Wow.
So the rents were really high, and I was going into really high quality spaces. And in retrospect, after everything crashed, I adjusted some of that. Mostly I adjusted to, let me get 2,100, 2,400 square feet, because that can accommodate 250, 300 students. I mean, our formula now is 300 students, 7 square feet per student. That's $1 million a year school. 600,000 a year net. I mean, that's really our target formula right now.
Okay. All right. Cool. Hey, Jose has a question. He said he's got to ask someone as successful as you are, and there's a big thing with Jose. Your morning and evening routine. What does that look like for you? And just kind of steering in a different direction for a minute.
Yeah. Well, it's changed over the years, right? When I was running the schools aggressively, and now I'm doing mostly consulting, and the schools are franchises. But when it was running staff, I mean, my weekly routine was I had a staff meeting every Monday. I had a staff meeting every Wednesday. I had a black belt class every Friday night. So I was training staff from noon to 12 or 1 every Monday morning, training staff from noon to 1 every Wednesday morning, running a black belt class every Friday night. Given that we were always a second shift, a bunch of my friends were morning people. I've never been a morning person, right? So if I was doing administrative work, doing all that kind of stuff, I was doing it 11 o'clock, midnight, at night, at the end of the day. So typically with the schools, prime time in the schools has always been, 3 to 9. So if I was working with staff, it either had to be after 9 or before 3. With my day, I kind of organized it as administrative was first thing in the morning, and then I would work on marketing and or staff development. So Monday and Wednesday was staff development. The other days were focusing on marketing. So I've never had the get up at 6 a.m. and and do the planning. I was more like get up at 9. And in more recent years, it was Starbucks. And before that, it was, find some place quiet with a legal pad to kind of figure out what to do today, right? Because really, Starbucks is kind of a recent phenomenon relative to that timeline. And then I would work late into the night.
Well, I have to say that I feel a little better hearing someone else is not a morning person
Oh, yeah,
because
through that.
I I've been a martial arts school owner since I was 19 years old, and I never really had a career or job before that. And getting up at 5 or 6 in the morning for me, see, I go the other way. I'll stay to the
Yeah,
12 or
yeah.
1 o'clock. But yeah. So anyway,
I used to have,
I always feel people ask me, "What time do you get up?" Like I don't know, nine,
yeah,
8.
yeah.
I go to the gym first, and then I get my office work done. I do my podcast.
When I was in Washington, Jeff and I, he got me hooked on going to movies. And it's like, what do you do when you get off work at 10 o'clock at night and you don't drink or smoke? Right. And back then you go to, you go to a club, everybody's smoking. So you're inundated with cigarette smoke back then. So if you're not a drinker and you're disgusted by cigarette smoke, when you get off work to me, it was always like anybody else who gets off work at 5 o'clock. Right. You don't get off work at 5 o'clock and go home and go to bed. You get off work at 5 o'clock and you go to a restaurant, go to a movie, do something or other. You can identify with this. Is always over the years, people would say, well, what do you think of the latest episode of ER? It's like, well, what the hell is that? The first time I ever saw primetime TV is when streaming became a thing, right? Is so you can stream it every time you want. Now I know what what people were talking about. For 30 years I had no idea. But yeah, I don't get it. I have a lot of friends who are morning people, but to me, you have to be at peak at 6 or 7 o'clock at night if you're running a school, right?
Right.
That's when I've got to be able to do enrollments back to back, renewals back to back, be high energy, make sure all the plates are spinning. Why the hell would I want to be up since 4 a.m. when I have to peak at 7 p.m. or at 6 p.m.?
Well, and that go time, whether you're starting at 3 o'clock or whatever, but that's pretty. That's like a major workout, and
Mhm.
I wish that I could say that I still know that feeling because I don't teach as much as
Yeah,
I once did. But man, that 4 to 8 o'clock, like go, like
yeah.
that is nonstop energy. That's like a full 8 hour day within that 4 hours. But I got to ask you because you said you got into movies. Total sidetrack here.
Yeah.
What's your favorite movie of all time?
Of all time?
Of all time.
Oh my God, that's hard. Um,
Well,
well, you have the. Go ahead.
nail down a top three.
Well, let's categorize. You
Okay.
have my high school favorite comedies. So that's got to be Young Frankenstein and Monty Python, The Holy Grail, right?
Okay.
So you've got the '70s comedies that are classics forever, and then you've got like the classic drama of what was it the Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise.
Jack
Um,
Nicholson.
where Tom Cruise was the attorney and Jack Nicholson was working on in Cuba. You Can't Handle the Truth. What was the
Oh, A
name?
Few Good Men.
A Few Good Men. There you go. There you go.
Yep.
So you've got classics like that. I don't know. There's so many. I mean, I have so many old movies that I can just quote. I can quote most of Monty Python, The Holy Grail, or Young Frankenstein. Probably my favorite serious movie is Patton.
Okay.
There's a couple of other really good bios and autobiographies over the years. In fact, right now I just finished watching Super Pumped and We Crashed and Dropout, which are of course it's Hollywood, so they want to pick on the failed entrepreneurs, but still you build a $45 billion company and you get kicked out. I don't consider that much of a failure.
Yeah, it's funny that you said earlier too that we didn't know we didn't know what these series were like because we were teaching martial arts, and so we would never get to see that until Netflix and Hulu and all
Yeah.
that stuff. I'm a huge movie buff, so I just love. I could probably spend the rest of the conversation just
Oh yeah.
talking about movies, but I have to throw it out there. My favorite movie of all time on any given day, it's going to go between one or two. It's either going to be The Godfather or it's going to be Goodfellas. I'm a
Yeah.
huge mafia fan, so
Yeah.
love
Yeah.
anything about the mafia. But
That was, a good friend of mine is Bernie Carrick, who was a former New York City police commissioner, and he was
mm,
Giuliani's right hand man. And him and Rudy Giuliani, their favorite is The Godfather. You know,
Okay.
he described Rudy Giuliani's management style when he was running New York as being basically a copy of The Godfather, you know, doing favors for people and maintaining all those personal relationships and stuff. So that's absolutely a classic.
Well, you know, sometimes the mafia uh, family type, it reminds me of martial arts in a
Oh yeah.
way, right? Like you go to bat for your
Oh well, that
friend.
was Nick Okinas.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Nick Okinas was totally The Godfather. I mean, he didn't have anybody killed, but it was totally that level of loyalty, that level of relationship. That was his management style always.
You know, I have not had the pleasure of ever meeting him in person. I know the name well, and I've heard many stories. As a matter of fact, Jose Escobar has talked about him quite a bit. Would love to have him on the show one day just to get to know him and talk with him a little bit
Yeah, he
more.
passed away a few years ago.
Oh, he
Yeah,
did.
so
I'm
that's not
I'm,
happening.
then I'm not going to have him on the show. His
No,
then,
no.
then I'm thinking of his son is who Jose.
John.
There you go. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, no. Nick passed. God, I'm not good. I'm not good at dates, but probably about 5 years ago.
Oh, okay.
As did his son and his daughter. Candy Kokinas and Mark Kokinas both passed before him. Sadly.
Well, you know, these are all names that I've heard over the years of being in the martial arts
Yeah.
industry, and you know, I got involved with Maya, the Martial Arts
Mhm.
Industry Association, in later in my career. But I never went to EFC events. I never
Yeah.
went to, you know, some of these other organizations. But Jose informed me he passed away 8 years ago. So
There you go.
uh,
There you go. Yeah.
I'm sorry that I
Yeah.
am not educated enough
Yeah.
to know that, but
He was
I'm learning more about him through others. I guess we can say then.
he
So
was a force of nature. I mean,
yeah.
there's absolutely no doubt about it. And um, you know, he's one of those that every day, you know, he worked in the office maybe 4 hours, and he had his morning routine, he had his afternoon routine. Then he went over to his country club, which was Kenwood, there in Maryland, and would play golf, play tennis, have lunch at the country club, and then come back to the office, and then be home in the evening. He was a real force of nature. But he was an early, again, you know, kind of the genesis of the martial arts business was at Fred Astaire with Pat Burleson. But Nick, you know, had more impact as far as the business side probably than anybody else. And you talk about Maya. I mean, that was Frank Silverman's background. Is he
Hmm.
was one of Greg Silva's guys, and Greg Silva was an original board of directors member. So, you know, the original board of directors was Don Southerton, me, Steve LaValle, Greg Silva, Jim Mather. I'm going to Keith Hafner. I'm going to forget a couple of names. Later on came the Kovars, Tim and Dave,
Hmm.
Tom Callos, you know, Buzz Durkin, a few of those guys. But it was, you know, it was industry leading back then. I mean, the Jhoon Rhee Institute was really the most powerful business operation in the country, from my perspective. And then you ended up with, as Nick and Jhoon Rhee had a falling out, Nick Okinas was a driving force.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, thanks for sharing history because
Yeah,
I always learn a little bit more. You know, again, just talking with others that knew these, you know, martial arts greats and people that
you
did
bet.
a lot of really good stuff. I mean, our industry would never be the
Yeah,
same with a
yeah,
lot of the people that you're talking about. Let's get back because you talked about you spent a lot of time studying marketing, so you could do all the things in the school, and you went and learned more about marketing.
yeah.
Talk about not only your education, but what should people hear from you now, and what do people need to know more about marketing that maybe you don't see?
Well, maybe to steal from Dan Kennedy, who I've studied with, I don't know, for 20 years now, very closely, is, you know, his line is, the minute you decide to go into business for yourself, you're forever in, you know, forever always in the business of marketing whatever it is you're doing, not in doing whatever it is you're doing. And you know, the other great book, The E-Myth, you know, talks about that. Is he, you know, Gerber's line was, a technician one day has an entrepreneurial seizure and opens a business, and then is shocked to find out that there's marketing, there's human resources, there's taxes, there's all this other stuff, right? The reason why most people in martial arts are broke is not that they're not a good technician, not that they're not a good athlete. And in fact, the mistake they make is decide to travel to Brazil, travel to China, try to learn some more technical stuff. Is the problem is they never grow past 30 students or 40 students or 80 students, and they never charge what they're worth because, if you have a trickle in the front door, you're always worried about raising your prices. And if you have a flood coming in, you're not worried about it, right? And so I think that's the biggest thing. I stole, I've got the facade of Wall Street in the background here, but I stole from Jay Abraham the idea of the Parthenon. So same idea. It's a lot of pillars that are always driving traffic. And again, what we see now is even some fairly sharp schools, they go, oh, wow, Google's working great. And that's all they do. Oh, wow, Facebook's working great. And that's all they do. I'm always trying to get people to have like 20 different things going on. What are our 6 or 7 different referral systems? What are our 10 or 15 things we're doing online? What are our different community outreach activities, working directly with the elementary schools, working with churches, working with organizations? And by the time you're done, you have 20 different things going on. And as you know, Murphy's Law is real. No matter how good you are at any of this stuff, you're going to have COVID hit, right? And then all of the community outreach stuff shut down. Nothing we can do about it. But Facebook went up 650% in engagement. Well, if you were already on Facebook, your number loaded. And so that's what I'm sure you saw it is almost everybody who was down during COVID, what it is they stopped enrolling people. They pulled back their marketing budget. They stopped Zoom. They didn't do anything. Our guys were up 20 or 30% that year. It's just amazing. The difference.
Right. No, for sure. And I've talked about that with a couple different school owners or consultants about what had happened in COVID, because you're right. A lot of people use that as I can't think of any other word than use it as an excuse of why not to work hard instead of being a little bit think outside the box, like Zoom. I mean, many of us that did well because we jumped on Zoom, like literally. And I'm in California, just to remind you, and COVID for us was it was definitely horrible. A challenge. It was a challenge because people just did not want to get out of their house. And so thank God for Zoom, because we're able to just jump on. I mean, I think the announcement hit on Friday and we were on Zoom by Monday. So that, and then going outside, training outside during COVID. Once we got the the go ahead to do that, I mean, a lot of schools would just be uncomfortable with that, but hey, we got to find a way. We got to find a way. And
by the way, all of the science supported. There was never any reason for martial arts schools or fitness centers to be shut down. The lockdowns didn't work. If you looked at the graph, it basically started at age 44, and all the problems were, if you're 75 years old with diabetes and overweight, you were screwed with this thing. But if you were students, I mean, what percentage of our clientele were anything other than 7, 12, 25, 32 and healthy, right? So there was never any reason for that. But, one of my clients is in Brick, New Jersey, which, if you don't know where that is, it's kind of midway between Atlantic City, New York City, and Philadelphia. He was up. He was up pretty dramatically. And I kept whining. We had already taught our other clients to use Zoom because we use it every week. But I kept whining at our guys. I say, you're always complaining to me because football, soccer, baseball, all these other activities, and you're whining that some other guy opened a school down the street. All that stuff is shut down. What do you have to complain about now, right? And I think the big thing beyond just teaching classes was the shift to doing intros and enrollments on Zoom, being willing to do it. And a lot of people tried to do it cheap. Well, I'll charge them $30 a month for Zoom, and we're charging $200 a month for face-to-face. No, our guys are now up to like $347 a month for a new enrollment and $500-$600 for the renewals. And we were moving the prices up during that time, not dropping the prices.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I think anybody will find an excuse
Mhm.
if that's what you're looking for. And
Yeah,
on the flip side, if you are looking for a way, you'll create that. And
yeah,
we were fortunate, even through that with Zoom, with outside, with anything, we did grow during that time, which I was very fortunate that. They were able to keep things going, and we were on Facebook every day with all kinds of different stuff. So it worked out. It worked out, and I won't even touch the whole COVID thing because I agree with everything you said, but
yeah.
we'll let that
Oh,
one
it's
go
just
for now.
it's just insane. It's just I've pissed a few people off on this, but it's like there were the New York Times did a survey of opinions about COVID. You may have seen this one. Is there was a massive spectrum of opinion, but if you were a Democrat, is you thought your odds of being in the hospital was like 50% if you got it, and if you were conservative, it was 2 or 3. Your answer was 2 or 3%, and so there's this weird spectrum of how fearful people were, and there was a weird spectrum on who they thought was at risk. So all of this locking down kids was ridiculous. But the again, if you the risk factors are and always have been, if you have heart condition, overweight, diabetes, neurological problems, those were the risk factors, right?
Hmm.
And there was a curve, a dramatic curve based on age, right? So unusual, we think of kids as being, this germ factory with the flu and so forth, but that wasn't this. The kids weren't giving it to each other, they weren't having symptoms, and they weren't sharing it with teachers or adults. What was happening is that, again, you're 75 years old, overweight, and you have diabetes. You better be covered in plastic and not going out and getting the first vaccination as soon as possible. But it was strange, the disparity in the way people were viewing it. The main thing, I was shocked, even if of all my friends, and I'm close friends with like the top 10 school owners in the world, they were mostly down 50%. Jeff Smith and I were working with all the top people who are friends, not necessarily clients, trying to say, well, no, you don't have to. Not only do you not have to be down, you can be up. Let's fix this mindset.
Right, right. Well, all I can say is thank God it's just about. Well, I mean, in my school for sure, it's over. We've been back for longer than we were off, but
Yeah.
thank God that it's kind of leveling out. I want to just kind of finish this up with your maybe your daily mantra. What are words that you live by?
Well, a little bit of it sounds trite, based on what we were just talking about, but every problem has an equal or greater opportunity. I forget whose quote that is, but if you look at everything that way, and if your initial reaction is, okay, this thing just happened, where's the opportunity in it? It completely reframes the way you look at any and everything that happens, right? Is I jokingly tell people, the best thing that ever happened to me was when I was 28 years old or 29 years old. I ended up chapter 7, chapter 11, and divorced all in the same year. Well, I got to tell you, after you go through that experience, I used to have a certificate on the wall where I had owed the IRS $168,000 in $2008 in payroll taxes, and they sent me a notice one day that had been paid in full. I used to have that framed on my wall in my office because it reminded me. I still have it. This isn't it, but I have a Rolex Presidential, and back what I had done when everything had crashed. And it was, and again, it was the worst recession since the Great Depression, round one. But when everything crashed, I had expected we're doing 1.5 million that year, and instead we did 700,000. And so I sat down that year and I said, I need to set a goal. I need to have something that I can work for to get everything. And of course, half the staff had quit, and everybody was in foul mood, one thing or another. And so I went down to the jewelry store and picked out the most expensive watch in the place, which was a Rolex Presidential. The one I have now would sell for like $37,000 if you walk in retail. And so I asked them, "Can I put that on what do you call it, layaway?" They said, "Sure." I said, "Well, okay. How long can you keep it in layaway, and how much do I need to give you?" So basically, they said we'd keep it as long as you're making payments on it every month. So I gave them $500, And every month I scraped together $500 and went and got them. But the rule for myself was I can only get that watch back, or I can only buy the watch if we hit $1 million this year, which was a 50% uptick from what we had done in the previous year. And so, that was the focus. Here's where we got to be. And actually, and anytime I'm feeling a little broke, I wear that watch, because I got that watch on November 1st, still had 2 months to go. And the last 2 months we did almost 400,000 in revenue after we hit the million. So the following year we hit 1.4. But it's a good reminder, is no matter how stressful things look, is it's easy to make a comeback. You may have seen it, but there's a great old bio of Trump, and they were interviewing Marla, wife number 2. And she recounts a story of she and Donald are walking down the street, and he sees a bum on the grate, and he says, "Marla, you see that bum on the grate?" She says, "Yes, Donald, what about him?" He said, "He's $380 million richer than I am." And she, of course, goes, "Donald, how can he possibly be $380 million richer than you are? We came here in a limo. You're living on the top of a building." He goes, "Yeah, he doesn't have a penny, and I'm $380 million in the hole." Well, it's a good story, because what happens is people have a bad month. They have something that punches them in the nose, right? It's the Mike Tyson quote, is everybody has a fight plan until they get punched in the nose. They get punched in the nose and most people crumble. You've seen, new fighters, first time the guy hits them harder than they expected to get hit, the fight is over. Well, in entrepreneurship, you're always going to get punched in the nose. There's going to be, we've had people who, I've had it, merchant account decided to keep $350,000 one day with no notice. And all of a sudden, $350,000 doesn't hit the account. Well, if you crawl under the table and give up, then you're done. And if you go, well, this is just one more thing to deal with, what's the opportunity here, and how do I get through it? That's the principle. And I think that's the thing that most people miss. And it's why half of the martial arts schools probably in the United States went out of business last 2 years. They didn't see the corresponding opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's it's just a matter of your outlook. It's just you find what you're looking for. If you look for an excuse, that's all you're going to find. If you look for the opportunity, you're going to continue to reap benefits. So, hey, I just want to thank you again for being on the show today. We're right at our hour mark, and I want to be respectful of your time, and I appreciate everybody watching. And thanks again to Jose for interacting with us today and asking a couple questions. But coming up, I'm looking at my schedule here. I got Dave Wheaton next, Solomon Brenner, Christopher Polt, Nick Doherty, and Jeff Smith. He's scheduled for May 16th. So I'm looking forward to talking with him, and I'm sure he'll bring your name up a few times.
I'm sure he will. Jeff and I have worked together since, I don't know. I started as part of the Jhoon Rhee Institute when he was the head instructor. So that's how far back it goes. But we've worked together for at least 50 years now, one way or the other.
That's amazing. Very, very cool. Well, thanks again for, sharing your story, sharing your experience. And there we go. There's Jose. He's still watching. Thanks again, buddy. Look forward to maybe catching up in person at some point, somewhere, sometime. But
anytime.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for the stories. And I look forward to seeing everybody again next week, Monday, 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, each and every Monday with the Master Motivation Show. Thank you guys so much. And Mr. Oliver, have a great rest of the day.
You too.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye, guys.